Mr. McClellen, can you tell us when were you born, where, something about your first family, mother, father?
Okay. I was born in 1956, so an old guy. And I was born in Kentucky. My family immigrated to the U.S. from Scotland back in the 1850s. And that was kind of an interesting story, but because my Scottish ancestor was a stonemason, he came to Kentucky because they quarried a lot of limestone there that was used for building construction. And that's where he went to get a job, and my family's been there ever since. So we, have been in Kentucky for 175 years, more or less now. And that's home. So when I retired from the Foreign Service, first thing I did was to move back to Kentucky. You always got to go back home. And I live on a small farm there now. It's a quarter of a mile up the road from the farm where I grew up. So when I was little, my parents moved out of the city to the farm. And I essentially grew up on a farm, grew up in the country. And that did a lot to shape my development, my growth, because I very early developed a love for nature, for the environment, for agriculture, for the farm life, and a respect for farmers and people who work the land. And that's carried with me all through my subsequent career. Because even as a diplomat, I was interested in trying to work on agricultural issues and working with people in the countryside and this sort of thing. So I was the youngest of 4 children. I was, like I said, born in 1956. There are 3 boys in my family and 1 girl, but I was always closest to my sister, because we shared common interest of music and art, and we were both more homebodies, whereas my 2 brothers were always out in the fields driving tractors and working with cattle and horses and whatnot. And I enjoyed that too, but my sister, because she's 7 years older, she was really a big sister. And, so she always had somebody to do something with, since there was not another girl in the family. And, but I was young enough, not to be in her way and not to be a problem for her. So I had a very happy childhood. Went to college at the University of Louisville, which is a major urban university in Kentucky. I studied political science with a heavy emphasis on Russian studies, and also journalism. And it was interesting during that time that I got interested actually in Yugoslavia. And because back then, this was during the Cold War. I was a student in university in the 1970s. And for some reason, I just got very interested in Yugoslavia. So I developed this idea that I wanted to be a photojournalist, hopefully work for National Geographic. That's where everybody wants to work if they're a photographer. And I wanted to kind of have a professional focus on Yugoslavia. So it was always my dream to go to Yugoslavia and visit all the different areas and get to know the different cultures and learn the different languages. And, I just thought it was a fascinating country. So I went to Syracuse for my master's degree, and that was in photojournalism. And Syracuse is one of the best universities in the world for studying photojournalism. It's it's definitely in the top 2 or 3 schools globally for that. And I studied photojournalism and international relations. But by the time I finished my master's degree, I knew I did not want to do photography for a living. And so I went to get a doctorate. It's like when you're going through college, if you don't know what you want to be when you grow up, you keep getting another degree to give yourself more time to think. And that's kind of what I was doing, because at every stage, I completely changed my career goals and had something else. But while I was at Syracuse, one of my housemates was a CIA brat, we call him. Both of his parents worked for the CIA, and he grew up in embassies and living abroad. And he was always telling us about growing up in Africa and Europe and all these other different countries, because his family moved around a lot. And because of him, I developed an interest in the Foreign Service. That's the American Diplomatic Corps. And so because of him, I took the Foreign Service exam, which is, at that time, was only given once a year. But it's a very, very difficult test. Only about 2% of the people who take it pass. And but I took it and I failed it the first time, but I failed it by 1 point. And where I failed it was in English. My English, I didn't pass the English test, even though I was a journalism major, which was kind of embarrassing. But I passed everything else pretty well. And so I thought, maybe this could be a career. So I resigned myself to study and prepare for it the next time. And I was determined to take the test again and to pass it. So I went for my doctor's degree. I went to Indiana University. And at Indiana, I was studying all international communications, international politics, Soviet studies, things like that. And I took the Foreign Service exam again, and I passed it the second time. Now, the process to get into the Foreign Service takes about 2 to 3 years normally, once you pass the test, because you have to go through all these investigations and clearances and oral interviews and medical exams and all this stuff. So by the time I finished my coursework, I was accepted into the Foreign Service. Now, what happened, though, was that when they gave me, I passed the oral interviews for my doctorate. I passed the oral exam, and you have to write a dissertation and you have to do oral exams. Mm-hmm. So I passed the orals, and then I was ready to do my dissertation, but I was accepted into the Foreign Service right at that moment. And I had to decide, okay, do I take this job as a diplomat, which could last me the rest of my life, or do I turn it down and do my dissertation and maybe get a job teaching someday? So that was a pretty easy decision to make. I went for the diplomatic service. And I tried to finish my dissertation, but I never could just because of the countries where I was working. And this was pre-internet. We didn't have Google and all these things to do research on the internet. So I did not finish my doctor's degree, but I had a very nice career in the Foreign Service. So I was in the Foreign Service for 30 years. And during that time, I worked in, starting from the beginning, North Yemen. This was before the country was unified. Then Egypt, where I was the director of the American Cultural Center, and that was an amazing experience. I really loved Egypt. But by the way, I kind of fell in love with the Middle East and the Muslim world at that point, and so I kept coming back to it, through the course of my career. After Egypt, I went to Russia, and this was just after Russia, right after communism had fallen. So Yeltsin was the president. It was all, post-communist, but the country was trying to figure out where it was going. Democracy was just starting. Fascinating time to be there. And I was there for 3 years. Then from Russia, I went to, back to the States for a short time. But then I came to Kosovo back in '96, just for a very short time. I was only supposed to come for a couple of weeks and open up the U.S. office. Now, at that time, and this is an interesting story about why the U.S. office was opened at that time, we had closed our big cultural center in Belgrade on Chika Ljubina street or neighborhood, whatever that was. But that was a big cultural center because it was the cultural center for Yugoslavia. And we had other ones around the country, but with the breakup of Yugoslavia and the United States shifting its priorities away from cultural centers, as a foreign policy objective, suddenly we had this huge cultural center for a very small country, and we just closed it. And Milosevic got actually very upset about that. Apparently, he, as a younger man, had used the cultural center a lot in his own studies and in his own experience in college and so forth. And he did not want us to close that center. So Milosevic approached our Secretary of State and asked us to reopen the cultural center in Belgrade. And at that time, we wanted to open up an office in Kosovo because things were just starting to develop. It was starting to get heated up a little bit. And so the Secretary of State at that time, who was Warren Christopher, said, okay, let's make a deal. We'll reopen a center in Belgrade, but you have to let us open up in Kosovo. And so he said, fine, okay, no problem. But it's got to be a cultural information office, no consulate, no political officers, nothing like that. So, he just wanted it to be a soft kind of program, nothing, he didn't want any military or political people, anything like that there. So I was given 2 weeks notice to go to Kosovo and open up this office. And it was really kind of funny because I was working in Washington at the time at the headquarters of the U.S. Information Agency. And I was called into the director's office and he said, we want to send you to Kosovo. And I literally said, where's that? And because honestly, I'd never heard of it. And he said, well, it's in Serbia. And I said, oh, okay, I know Serbia. And he showed me on a map, it was this little diamond-shaped corner down at the bottom. And I said, oh, that sounds interesting. He said, we need you to go there and open up an office. We'll, send you there. We'll have someone from Belgrade help you out. We'll get you a car, blah, blah, blah. But we need to have it open in about 2 weeks. Okay, so get on a plane. I go to Vienna. And in Vienna, at the U.S. Embassy, they had a car for me. So they gave me this car, and I drove from Vienna down to Belgrade. And I picked up a local employee at the embassy in Belgrade. He was the only Albanian in the embassy in Belgrade, the only Albanian speaker. Now, he had grown up in Belgrade. He had always gone to schools in Belgrade. So Serbian was really his first language almost. But they always spoke Albanian at home. But he was not educated in Albanian. Okay, but he spoke it quite well, certainly well enough. And so he came with me to be my interpreter and assistant. So we drove down from Belgrade to Pristina. Our first stop, of course, was to go visit Dr. Rugova at the little LDK headquarters over here by the stadium. And we met his assistant chief of staff, I'm not sure what his title was at the time, but Mr. Adnan Marovsi. And Adnan was basically assigned to me to get everything we needed. So he had several houses already lined up that would be possible centers for us. We went and looked at them. We chose the one in Dragadan. And at the time, it was occupied. The family was still living there. But they moved out in about 3 days. The house was then empty, and we were able to bring in computers and stuff from Belgrade, from the embassy. We went to local furniture stores and got all the furniture we needed, and in 2 weeks, we opened the American Center in Dragadan, the U.S. Information Office. And the ambassador came down, the assistant secretary of state for Europe flew in for it, had all these high-level officials. And at the opening of the U.S. Information Office, we had, of course, Dr. Rugova, all these officials from LDK, high-level people. We also had the Serbian officials. They sent, I think, one guy. He was like the director, the boss, the representative, whatever he was called. His office was at the Grand Hotel. And he very reluctantly, came to join our event, because for protocol reasons, they kind of had to. And I think Belgrade just told him, go there, do what you have to do, and then leave. And so we had this grand opening. Approximately, best we could figure, about 5,000 people turned out for the opening. It was, you're too young to remember this, but all of Dragadan was just covered with people. The streets, the alleys, all the houses around the center, the balconies were crowded. Everybody just opened their doors and let friends, family, strangers, whoever come in and watch, what was happening from their balconies. Yards were full of people. You couldn't move in Dragadan hardly. But Dr. Rugova and the Assistant Secretary for Europe from Washington together raised the American flag over Dragadan, and that was the first time I think a foreign flag flew in Kosovo. And it was a huge event. I mean, it was hugely emotional for, most of the people there, certainly for Dr. Rugova and them. But we had to be very, very careful to keep it at cultural programming. Okay, but what then started happening is that every Western embassy in Belgrade, the Germans, the Swiss, the Norwegians, the British, everybody who was concerned about Kosovo, which was basically all of them, started coming down to visit Kosovo on a regular basis, because now all the diplomats in Belgrade had a place where they could stop. They could always start with our office. They could come, they could talk to a foreign official. They could do it in English, obviously. And they could kind of get a feel for whatever was needed. We could give them tips about where to stay, who to talk to. We could make appointments for them, introduce them to whoever they needed to meet. And so it was a huge help to the entire diplomatic community to be able to come down to Kosovo and have a port of call, so to speak, a place where they could check in. We would always go to the restaurant that was almost next door. I can't remember the name of it now, but it was a really good restaurant. And that became the hangout for diplomats. And it helped everyone to be able to report better about what was going on in Kosovo. And so they would usually start with us, then they would go see Dr. Rugova, then they would go visit other political factions. Once we started talking closely with the Islamic community and with Bishop Artemia of the Orthodox Church, they started meeting with them too. We would just make phone calls for them and set them up, and we could help them find interpreters if they needed them and so forth. Because of course none of the diplomats in Belgrade spoke Albanian. Some of them did speak Serbian, and of course at that time any Albanian political leader was happy to meet with foreigners and speak Serbian if that's what it took to communicate. But in time, they started getting freelance interpreters down here that they could call and, just have them for a day or 2 days to help with meetings and whatever. And so the center made a huge difference in how the West, how the outside world viewed Kosovo. Of course, under Dr. Rugova and the LDK, it was very, very important to keep peace in Kosovo. You have to remember that this is while Bosnia was raging. Certainly Bosnia was starting to settle down a little bit, but we had seen the violence in Bosnia. And everyone knew that if that same kind of stuff started happening in Kosovo, it would be a disaster. So it was vital to keep the peace, by whatever means were necessary. But then once Western diplomats began to visit and began to understand what was going on here, then then Europe and North America could make a more concerted response to events in Kosovo, to support, human rights here, to support greater autonomy, because at that time, nobody supported independence, because the breakup of Yugoslavia, we had already seen what would happen when the country broke up. And we were afraid that if Kosovo broke off, it would be the same thing over again. Now, obviously, that changed once the war started. Once the violence started in Kosovo and you got into the war with the ethnic cleansing and, the refugee camps in Macedonia, at that point, all bets were off and everybody supported independence. So the situation completely changed at that point. But also, because, we had this presence here, once after my time, actually, like after 1997, you got into the Kosovo Diplomatic Observer Mission, KDOM it was called. And again, our office was the focal point of that, because once we had a presence in Kosovo, it was a lot easier to expand that presence than to come in and start a presence from zero. You know what I mean? So setting up that cultural office in the very beginning was a toehold, if you will, that enabled the United States to do a lot more in Kosovo, to have a much bigger presence. And our political staff in Belgrade were coming down like literally every 2 weeks. They were just constantly coming down. The political officer at that time was a gentleman named Nick Hill. And if his last name rings a bell with you, he's the brother of Chris Hill, Ambassador Chris Hill. And Nick was, he was the political officer. He was extremely interested in Kosovo and what was happening here. And his mandate really was to follow the events that were going on here. So he started coming down every couple of weeks. He would stay at the center. We would do meetings with Dr. Rugova and all of the various political factions. We would meet with the Serb leadership. We would visit religious leaders, NGOs. I mean, Adam Domaci, for example, we would invariably go to his NGO and talk to him, because at that time, so many of the political leaders had NGOs. That was kind of their base for operation. It gave them a way to function and to have a presence, have an office, so to speak. And, we gave grants to a lot of these organizations, and so did the Europeans. Europeans were much better about it than we were, to be honest. But they would make the rounds of these different NGOs and talk to the women's groups, the union groups, the Serbs and the Albanians, meet with the Roma, the Gypsies, meet with the Bosniaks. We even went out to Janjevo and talked to the Croats, at some point. So it was very important to try to follow the events with as many viewpoints as possible and to get an understanding of things from as many perspectives as possible, so that we could really start to see the picture of of Kosovo. Think of Kosovo as a mosaic. If you only look at 3 or 4 of the little stones that make up a big mosaic, you have no idea what the picture is. You may understand what that little stone is, what that one little square of color, maybe represents, but you don't see the whole picture. But once you start getting a lot of the pieces and you get them into the picture, then the image starts to form, and then you can really see the whole picture and understand what's happening. And it was also vital for all of these people to get out of Pristina. So they would make trips to Pjesa. They would go to Prizren. They would go to Kosovo Polja, Fushkosova, to see the monuments, understand the mythologies, the perspectives of different things. Look at the Turkish monuments from the Ottoman period. Again, to just get the historical perspective from all the different viewpoints. And this could not have happened without some kind of diplomatic presence in Kosovo from somebody. Now, we happen to be the first, and to be honest, I doubt Milosevic would have let anyone else in, but we had something he wanted, and so he was ready to make a deal with us. But I think if he had understood how the office could possibly influence events with the entire diplomatic community, he might not have done it.